Welcome back to the show. The Johnnies remain atop the preseason top 25 and 1 rankings over at CBS Sports. One player's decision allowing Rick Pitino to leapfrog Kelvin Sampson in the previous edition as Zuby Ejiofor returns after averaging nearly 15 points per game for the Big East champs. So here's what the top 10 of the top 25 and 1 looks like currently, and even before the shakeup at 1 and 2, no changes to 3 and 10. BYU sitting behind Houston and St. John's. And you do see there Jacqueline's reigning national champion Florida Gators checking in.
Let's go.
At number 6. All right, let's bring in Gary Parrish, who puts the rankings together, and Kyle Boone, already shaking his head, Kyle. I don't know how many times he's going to shake his head with GP. We're going to have to wait and find out. Let's get to St. John's. Again, a couple days ago, GP, you had to sort of flip-flop them because of a decision from a single player. What decision was that, and how did it affect the top of the rankings for you?
The decision comes at Houston when Pop Isaacs decommitted and decided to commit to Texas A&M after Milos Uzan announced he was withdrawing from the NBA draft to return to Houston. So from the projected lineup that Kelvin Sampson was going to throw out there, they lost an experienced, impactful, high-major guard in Pop Isaacs and simply have not yet replaced him with a similar caliber player. So I used that opportunity to drop Houston from 1 down to 2, not too far, because it's still Houston, it's still Kelvin Sampson. But I did allow me to move St. John's up to the top spot. As you mentioned, Zuby Ejiofor among the returning players back. I don't love that he's the only real important piece from that Big East championship team that is going to be back at St. John's. But the truth is, Duke last year only returned one player who averaged at least 7.8 points per game. That was Tyrese Proctor, and they had to fill everything else around him. And by the time we got to the Final Four, Duke was still playing and was the favorite to win it all. So roster continuity is still important. I acknowledge that, but it doesn't seem to be as important as it once was. Simply put, St. John's with Zuby Ejiofor up front and what I believe is the best recruiting class in the country, highlighted by transfers that have already been impactful at the high major level. You give that roster to Rick Pitino, one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time, and I think you've got a team that absolutely deserves consideration for number 1 in the country and is going to have a chance to win a national championship. And if it goes down that way, Rick Pitino will be a man who has won 3 championships at 3 different schools. He's already done it at Kentucky. He's already done it at Louisville. With this roster in place in Queens, he's got a chance to do it at St. John's.
Yeah, GP, I think maybe you could pick some nits here. I would have Houston at number 1. I would put St. John's a little bit lower, and I think you alluded to maybe the questions or concerns around St. John's, and it's why I'd have them a little bit lower. They are bringing in 9 new pieces from last year's roster. They were really good last season under Rick Pitino. There's no question about it. But the lack of continuity on this roster, I think will end up hurting St. John's. They have some talented guys incoming. Ian Jackson, who I'm very high on. I think the offense will take a step forward. The big question, GP, is obviously under Rick Pitino, their defense has always been amazing. That is what they built their championship team around at Louisville when they won it a decade ago. The offense, I think, is the major question. It's what failed them in the NCAA tournament. It could be what fails them next year, and I don't have a ton of confidence on offense going into next season. That's why I would not have them at number 1.
GP, you want to do a final word and just what Boone had said about your Johnny's take?
Well, I would say this. I accept every point and acknowledge up front, this is not going to be a situation, I don't believe, where we get to it's time to vote in the preseason AP poll and one school is going to get 65 first-place votes, or one school is even going to get 55 first-place votes. You're going to see Houston get some first-place votes. You will probably, by the time we get there, see Duke get some first-place votes, Florida perhaps, UConn perhaps, Purdue perhaps. But I do think St. John's is a part of that conversation. And obviously there's a million different variables. It is May 29th. And on May 29th, 2024, I don't think there's a single person on the planet who thought Florida would be the best team in the country. So it's all subjective, as always, we'll see. But if you are looking at rosters and coaches and combining those things, who has the best chance to really take it to a high level? Rick Pitino with this roster, I think, belongs on that list.
Fair enough, and you touched upon Houston, so we'll skip that conversation in this segment. Let's get to UConn, previously the 2-time reigning national champs. Gary, but they're still coming in hot in your top 10 and coming in your top 5.
Well, after what happened last season when they won the first national championship, remade the roster, and then a lot of people had them preseason top 5, and it just didn't go that way. They went 0-3 in Maui and never quite figured out exactly what they were. They had injury problems, but that team, Dan Hurley would tell you, did not meet expectations. So here we are again, and obviously, you can interpret player evaluations a lot of different ways. But when I look at this roster that Dan and his staff have put together in advance of next season, I actually think it is better equipped to win a national championship or even compete for a national championship than the roster was heading into last season. So we now know there was no way UConn was going to go back-to-back, or at least we now know it didn't happen. But as UConn got the type of roster in place, headlined by, I think, Solo Ball, the returning guard who should have a breakthrough All-American level season, do I think this roster is good enough to put Dan and UConn in a chance to maybe win 2 national championships in a 3-year span? Absolutely. The pieces are in place.
Yeah, I'm buying stock in UConn. I'm here with GP. I think this ranking fits UConn and the projection for next season. Not only are they bringing back Solo Ball, Taurus Reed, Alex Caravan, they're bringing in a 5-star recruit. And, oh, by the way, they're being led by Dan Hurley, who he has said is the best coach in the bleeping sport. It's hard to argue, given the results the last couple of years. He's got 2 rings to prove it. I believe UConn will be a team that I will not bet against next season. They should be a preseason top 5 team, given what they return and what that roster looks like going into next year.
We talked about the Florida Gators right behind the UConn Huskies at number 6. GP, a team that they beat, of course, in UConn's second round of the tournament this past year.
Florida enters this season a lot like UConn entered last season with, at least on paper, what most believe is a realistic chance to become back-to-back national champions. They had the front court in place, and it was just a matter of keeping those guys out of the NBA draft. Alex Condon obviously went through the process, but ultimately withdrew. Thomas Hauck will be back, and Chinyelu as well. So they're loaded up front. They just needed to replace the awesome guards that they lost for exhausted eligibility, and they have been able to do that with the biggest late addition being Boogie Flan, the transfer from Arkansas. So Todd Golden built his national championship team through the transfer portal very deliberately, and now he's done it again, or at least put himself in a position to compete for the biggest trophy in the sport again. As you can tell, I don't have Florida ranked number 1 in the preseason, but there are smart people who believe in them as a legitimate candidate to be the preseason number 1, and I understand the sentiment behind that because the roster does look the part.
No follow from Mooney here. Let's get to Michigan at number 8. Dusty May, transfer portal targets once again. GP given a couple of his big guys departing.
Yeah, they really got busy in the transfer portal at Michigan very early and landed one of the top transfers on the market in Yaxel Lindenberg, the transfer from UAB. He went through the NBA draft process like a number of players, but ultimately I think even though it was possible he would get picked and get a guaranteed contract in the NBA, Yaxel realized what I believe a lot of borderline NBA prospects are realizing right now, which is that there is possibly more money to be made in college at this moment than there is as a professional. So you get him back as the biggest piece of a transfer portal class. And Dusty May, after being really impressive in year 1 in Ann Arbor, is going to have a team that looks like it could be even better in year 2.
Yeah, Dusty May hit on the transfer portal class last year. That's why they were able to have so much success with Vlad Golden, with Danny Wolf, with Roddy Gale, and Yaxel Lindenberg looks next in line to take that step. He was a star at UAB. I think he will step in and be a star very early for this Michigan team. I was in Chicago at the NBA Combine, and Yaxel was the buzz. Everyone believed that he had measured well, he performed well, to be a point to where he was projected as a first-round pick. Now he's coming back to college. I think Michigan can build the plane around him. They've got some returning pieces. They have some continuity. There's a lot to like here with this Wolverines team that Dusty May and that staff has put together.
One more team before we have to hit a break here on CBS Sports Network. That's the Duke Blue Devils and John Shire. Life without Cooper Flagg, GP, but reinforcements on the way with a very familiar last name at Cameron Indoor.
They'll have a couple of young men with a familiar last name, and Cameron Boozer is the one you need to pay attention to. He's the five-star elite projected one-and-done prospect who should have an immediate and massive impact at Duke from the moment he sets foot inside Cameron Indoor. He is a terrific prospect that has been on the national radar for years and years and years. Now it finally arrives. Time for him to enroll in college. And I don't know that he'll have as much hype as Cooper Flagg, but he is going to be one of the best, if not the best freshman in America. And he's among the reasons Duke has a chance to go to a second Final Four under Jon Scheyer. I do not believe this roster, as currently constructed, is as talented as last season's roster. Losing Cedric Coward, the transfer from Washington State who had committed to Duke, to the NBA draft is not something I think they anticipated or at least expected the moment they took that commitment, but they did bounce back, grab a commitment from an international prospect who projects as a one-and-done player as well. So Duke is going to be talented as usual, younger than most of the sport, but still in a position to compete at the top of the ACC, and by extension, yes, I think the top of the sport as well.
And it says a lot, too, right, about Jon Scheyer and this Duke staff that they lose potential 3 lottery picks and end up as a potential preseason top 10 team. Isaiah Evans is back. He's a former 5-star recruit. The Boozer twins are in. They lose Coward to the NBA draft. And, oh, by the way, they bring in Dame Sarr from the international level, who is widely regarded as one of the best prospects in the 2026 draft. Duke is going to be loaded again. They won 35 games last season with length, with scoring, and with defense. I think they will have all 3 of those combinations next year again, and Duke should be considered once again a preseason contender to win the national championship.
Guys, sit tight. We're going to hit that break and come back here on CBS Sports Network and HQ Spotlight. We'll tackle 11 through 20 with the fellas, including Mark Pope in Kentucky, and also one team in conference that moved up 10 spots today. All right, let's pick up where we left off with the top 25 and 1 for men's college basketball. Arizona Wildcats start this portion of the list at 11. We do have 4 SEC schools dominating this page. We saw a historic year for the league last year, 14 teams into the tournament. 14 out of 16, by the way, which beat the previous record of 11 by the Big East a little over a decade ago. All right, back here with Gary and Kyle. GP, Kentucky, whether it's Coach Cal or Coach Pope, a lot of turnover. It's expected there. What do we make of this Wildcats team moving forward?
Well, for the second straight year, Mark Pope has done a tremendous job in the transfer portal, getting Kentucky to a place where it's going to be able to compete for an SEC title and a trip to the Final Four, even a national championship. Last offseason, he had to start literally from scratch, like 0 returning players after John Calipari left Kentucky for Arkansas. This time, it's not quite that dramatic, and he got big news late Wednesday when Otega Oweh announced publicly that he was withdrawing from the NBA draft to return to Kentucky for another season. Now, to be clear, that was a big announcement, but not unexpected. His presence had always been expected on this Kentucky roster. Simply put, when your options are enter the draft, stay in the draft, and maybe get picked, maybe don't get picked, possibly go in the second round, maybe get a 2-way contract, or you can just stay right where you are, be Kentucky's best player, or at least one of Kentucky's best players, at a rate of multiple $1 million. I never want to make other people's decisions for them, but that seemed like a sensible decision to me. Not surprised Oweh is back, and as long as he was going to come back to Lexington, given what Mark and his staff were able to do elsewhere in the transfer portal this offseason, the Wildcats are going to be set up to go back to the NCAA tournament and fill up Rupp Arena consistently again with a winning basketball team.
Yeah, to GP's point here, Oweh is a guy who, at least in NBA circles, was not expected to be a first-round pick. This is a guy who a lot of NBA teams expected would come back to school, and he is coming back to school. It's a significant addition for Kentucky, just keeping a guy in-house. And Mark Pope has done a great job building through the transfer portal, as GP mentioned, Jaden Quaintance, Jalen Lowe, among the several new faces. Next year, they built this roster again through the transfer portal. They're going to have length. They're going to have shot making at a really high level. I think this Kentucky team will surprise some people. They were able to compete last season with teams with their offense. I think their defense will take a step forward in the second year under Mark Pope.
So let's get to the biggest riser, 10 spots. You know, as I was getting ready for this segment, guys, Alabama was 24 this morning, and then Gary comes out and updates it and puts them up 10 spots to 14. GP, what went into the Crimson Tide moving up today?
Labaron Philon's decision to, at the last minute, withdraw from the 2025 NBA draft and announce a return to Tuscaloosa. The reason this was the motivating factor behind the biggest movement in the top 25 and 1 from Wednesday to Thursday is because this was not expected. Tahad Pettiford back to Auburn, expected. Otega Oweh back to Kentucky, expected. Miles Byrd back to San Diego State, that was expected. But this was a surprise because KB can tell you he was at the NBA draft combine, and Labaron Philon said there, I'm, quote, all in on the NBA draft. All indications were that he was not even considering a return to college basketball. But at some point, and I think this is going to happen annually as long as we're operating in this structure, it gets time to where you have to make a decision, and what you wanted to do or what you thought you were going to do 3 weeks ago doesn't really matter. So yeah, he did go on record in saying he's all in on the draft, but as the time approached to actually make a final decision, his options were a lot like a lot of these guys' options. Stay in the draft and we'll see what happens, or take millions of dollars from Alabama, sit tight, have a great sophomore season, see where your NBA draft stock is from a year from now. But in the meantime, pocket real money, play meaningful college basketball games, and try to, get another Final Four banner hanging in Tuscaloosa. Again, even though this is not something Labaron Philon said he was considering at the NBA draft combine, I am not surprised that he ultimately reversed course, because if you're talking to any sort of financial advisor, they would probably tell you this is the right decision to make at this time.
Yeah, Philon's a guy who actually had a strong pre-draft process and yet still only rose, I think, to a range where he was expected to be drafted in the 25 to 35 range. And, that is not a guaranteed first-round pick. That's probably a guaranteed contract. But, I think if you're looking at the situations, Philon coming back to Alabama, he's going to be the centerpiece for that team. They were number 1 in adjusted tempo last season. Philon is an absolute flash in the pan. So, I think the move up 10 spots in Parrish's ranking makes a lot of sense. Alabama, one of the most fun offensive teams in college basketball. Philon will be the leader of that next season. Obviously, as you know, Mark Sears moving on. The Crimson Tide probably not going to miss a beat next season because he is back.
All right, so let's break format slightly, guys. I'm going to give Boone a couple of teams that moved down ever so slightly because of the Alabama movement here. Oregon at 17. Do you agree with that with GP, Kyle?
I think that's about right. Yeah, you got Nate Biddle, who was a little bit of a surprise return. I actually got a message from an evaluator this morning saying, I thought Nate Biddle would absolutely stay in the NBA draft and could have helped a team on a playoff roster pretty early in his career. He's a 7-footer who can shoot, defend, add size and experience. I think this Oregon team is appropriately ranked. They have added some length. They've added some shooting. I think they'll be a contender at the top of that conference, and I think number 17 is about right for the Ducks.
What about Auburn at 19 that GP has, given all the stuff that they've had to deal with in the portal?
So,
yeah, I would probably...
some people might...
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, KB.
No, I would not have Auburn ranked. Just to step on your toes here once again. They're losing Janai Broome. They're losing Dylan Cardwell. They're losing Chad Baker-Mazar. Obviously, Tahad Pettiford coming back is significant, but they've got 4 incoming transfers. They've got a number of high school recruits incoming. There's a lot of moving pieces here with this Bruce Pearl-led Tigers team. I don't have a ton of confidence projecting Auburn moving forward, but I'll throw it to you, GP. This is your ranking. You have them at number 19.
At some point, I do tend to trust programs if things are equal or similar, and Auburn has become, under Bruce Pearl, a program that you can trust. They are almost always. Todd Pettiford decision to return to Auburn, Again, big headline, but something that was always expected, had been baked into the top 25 and won literally since the version 1 that posted the day after the national championship game. So if you're an Auburn fan who clicked on today and wanted to know why Auburn didn't move in the upward direction, it's because the big headline from last night, that's been a part of this equation the entire time.
GP, back at you for Arkansas at 20.
Well, they didn't get great news at the draft deadline the way that other SEC schools did, because their leading scorer, Duthero, decided to remain in the NBA draft, in part because he actually does have a shot to be picked in the first round. But Arkansas is still going to be strong. They're bringing back Carter Knox, bringing back Billy Richmond. John Calipari will never be short on talent, and I know it got off to a rough start in Fayetteville, but he got that team pulled together, and they were playing at a pretty high level as the NCAA tournament unfolded. This is a roster that is undeniably top 20 worthy, and now we get to see what the Hall of Fame coach can do with it in year 2 at Arkansas.
And finally, GP, Zags headlining the 21-26 slate.
Well, so they had a transfer from Grand Canyon just earlier this week that would theoretically move them up in the rankings, but because Alabama jumped them, they sort of stay right at 21. But as you know, Mark Few has had a team that's been a constant presence in the NCAA tournament, a usual king of the West Coast Conference, and this Gonzaga roster is not going to blow anybody away in terms of talent the way some of the best Gonzaga rosters have done in previous years. I don't know if this is the type of roster that can take the Zags to a Final Four like they've been there twice already, but it is still a roster that's going to be the best in its league, one of the best 25 in the country, and the Zags are not going anywhere. They're going to be a brand we continue to talk about throughout the 2025-26 season.
Yeah, and they've got some guys who are coming back, among them Braden Huff and Graham Ike. This Gonzaga team, I think, has some questions, though, about how they will replace their playmaking. With Ryan Nembhard leaving for the NBA, he led college basketball in assists last season. He really stood out at the NBA Combine when I was there in Chicago as a playmaker, a table setter. They will need to find someone to fill that role for the Bulldogs, but no question, they will have the size, the length, the defense, and I think the shooting to surround whoever steps up in that role for Gonzaga, which, once again, will be expected to be the kings of the WCC.
Guys, certainly appreciate it. Catch Gary Parrish's top 25 and 1 at full length at CBSSports.com. And check out GP as well as Matt Norlander on their show Eye on College Basketball. However you listen to your podcast, check them out on YouTube. Scan that QR code ASAP.